Many of the British officers in Ireland were sympathetic to the demands of the Unionists. And in 1914, with the world on the brink of war, you had an incident which has gone down in history as the Curragh Mutiny, where an officer asked for assurances from the British government that he would never be called upon to use force against the Ulster Unionists if they rebelled. Because you see, a contingency plan had been drawn up. What would happen if there was civil war? What would happen if the Ulster Unionists did launch a revolution? And they didn't want this to happen. And many of the officers said, we actually wouldn't fight. We would refuse to fight. And they went to get those assurances, and those assurances were given. And Asquith was later so furious with his war minister, he ended up firing him because this was extraordinary. And when people looked at that Curragh Mutiny then, what they said was, well, what is going to happen? The British military won't get involved, so is Ireland going to tear apart completely? And these events were being studied all across Europe. These events helped influence the drift to war in the summer of 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Because Germany, Imperial Germany, and the other imperial powers were convinced that Britain would be unable to fight a war because Britain was falling apart internally. And Asquith himself, the British Prime Minister, played into those thoughts because he admitted publicly that there might be a civil war. And the King, George VI, was so furious that he ended up calling for an Irish convention, a Buckingham Palace conference, which he hosted himself, to bring all the parties together to see if a resolution could be called. Andrew Bonar-Law was the leader of the Conservative Party. And by 1914, the summer of that year, he had realised that maybe things had gone too far. He had been supporting the Unionists in their campaign, but he'd been doing it to get the Conservatives back into power. This was a way of wrecking Home Rule and wrecking the Liberal government. And in the summer of 1914, he sent a message to Asquith, I would like to meet you. I would like to talk about this privately. And he arranged for a car to pick up Asquith. And Asquith, to give an indication of just how tense things were, Asquith was convinced that he was going to be kidnapped, that this might be an attempted coup. But the two men met and they realised there was common ground. They agreed that they had to de-escalate tensions, that they could not risk Ireland going up in flames. And then the First World War broke out. And Asquith later said, he said 6 months later, that this was the greatest stroke of luck in his entire political career. This was the best thing that had ever happened to him, the outbreak of the war, because it saved everything. It shelved Home Rule, it allowed it to be postponed until the war was over, and suddenly there was no risk of civil war. The Ulster Unionists, the UVF, they threw their weight in behind the war effort. The Ulster Volunteer Force went off to fight for the British Army. And the conflict was forgiven about. And that was the end of the Home Rule crisis. It ended Carsons' career as a rebel. He ended up becoming Attorney General for England in 1915. And although he resigned a year later, he had messed up on some of the military campaigns, Gallipoli and so on. It showed the great extraordinary thing that Carson, the man who could have been arrested for treason in 1914, serving in the cabinet as the Attorney General, its defender of the laws of the country, a year later. An extraordinary reversal. And really, if the war hadn't broken out in 1914, it is impossible to see how civil war in Ireland could have been averted. It is impossible to see how Carson would have had any other choice but to become another great Irish rebel leader. But this time, an Irish rebel leader fighting to remain within the empire. He helped bring about the fall of Asquith's government in 1916, and a new government took over under Lloyd George. And he returned as a minister without portfolio, but his war record was not good. and that damaged his reputation so much. Politics, though, had a way of, I suppose, changing things for Carson. Because after the war, everything had changed in Ireland. The execution of the 1916 leaders had created momentum, a momentum that went beyond Home Rule. And then with the outbreak of the Irish War of Independence in 1919, there was a demand for not just Home Rule, but independence. Not just Home Rule, but an independent Irish Republic. And those events overtook now Carson, who no longer was able to call on an armed paramilitary force to defend Ulster, to defend all of Ireland. And so in 1920, you see the effective Partition of Ireland. The Government of Ireland Act is passed, and that brings about the Partition of Ireland with the creation of, effectively, a Home Rule Parliament in Ulster. The Government of Ireland Act applies to the whole island, but of course they can't do anything in the south because the country is experiencing this turbulent war. It's refusing to recognise the legitimacy of the state. And so the result of all of that fighting was that Carson had got Home Rule for a part of the country, where his ambition had been to wreck it for the entire 32 counties. And in that new state, which came into effect in January 1921, Carson was offered the chance to lead the new Northern government. But he refused. He shrugged it aside. This was not suitable for someone as great as him. This was not what he had wanted. And he passed it over to his deputy, James Craig, and in a way that offended many of his own supporters because he had been so dismissive. And what happened then? The War of Independence in the south was resolved with a truce. A treaty was negotiated, and with that treaty, an Irish Free State was created and the Partition of Ireland was confirmed. Many people blame the treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, for bringing about the Partition of Ireland. The reality is that Ireland had already been partitioned. It had been partitioned in 1920, but the treaty confirmed that. And even the fact that the partitioned area wasn't the 9 counties of Ulster. They didn't do that because Donegal, Fermanagh, Donegal had a majority Catholic population. Monaghan and Cavan had Catholic populations. They left it at 6. Derry, Antrim, Dan, Armagh, Fermanagh and Tyrone. And Fermanagh and Tyrone, well, there it was close enough between Catholic and Protestant. But they figured 4 counties, well, that would be too small to be economically viable. 9, too risky, too many Catholics. 6, that'd be just enough. And in that treaty negotiation, there was the promise of a boundary commission, a group of people from all sides, chaired by a neutral judge, who would review the territory. And it was held out to them that, well, Fermanagh and Tyrone, that'll go to the Free State. But the Boundary Commission ended up pretty much just confirming everything in 1926. Carson was a vehement enemy of that Anglo-Irish treaty. And he felt betrayed. He felt betrayed by all the supporters in Britain who had claimed to be backing them in the 1910s while they had been marching with the Ulster Volunteers, while they had been threatening war and resistance, because they had gone along with it. They had signed up to this. And he realised that they had been used. They had been used to get the Conservatives back into power. Now, by this time, he was in the House of Lords in Britain. He was a law lord. He had, in other words, been put there as a distinguished law person who would be presiding over certain cases. He was now a major legal authority in the land. And there was a convention that the law lords would not discuss politics. They were above all of that. They would not engage in party disputes. But Carson ignored that. And the maiden speech that he made in the House of Lords was a vehement attack on all that had happened in this period. He said, "Loyalty is a strange thing. It is something you cannot get sitting around a table and trying to find a formula for an oath of allegiance which means nothing. It is something born and bred in you." And then he attacked the Conservatives, the Tories, for having played him, for having played Ulster. What a fool I was! I was only a puppet, and so was Ulster, and so was Ireland, in the political game that was to get the Conservative Party into power. These terms were not passed on their merits, not at all. They were passed with a revolver pointed at your heads. And you know it. I ask your lordships, ought Unionist leaders to have been a party to that? Unionist leaders who had undertaken to defend Unionist policy. Of all the men in my experience that I think the most loathsome, it is those who will sell their friends for the purpose of conciliating their enemies. Now, Lord Birkenhead was in the British government at that time. He'd helped negotiate the treaty. And he said he was so shocked by the language, the vehemence, the passion of this, that he said that these words would have been immature on the lips of a schoolgirl. Many of Carsons' own friends, including Craig, were embarrassed by his outburst, but it was what he meant. And so, when we look at Carsons' legacy, it is a legacy of division, it is a legacy of partition, and in a way that statue at Stormont, with the arm outstretched, is a testament to a man who helped bring about a clash between two visions of Irish identity. One based on Irish independence and separatism, and another based on Irish independence. Partition ended up removing 3/4 of the Irish Protestants from the Irish state. They ended up in Northern Ireland. In 1926, less than 8% of the population was Protestant. And I think the real tragedy of Carsons' career is that despite his protestations of loyalty, he wasn't able to keep Ireland all at one piece. So the legacy of Carson is he's one of the founding fathers of modern unionism. He left an article of faith. He left a message of resistance to his successors, continuing that chant of Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right. He left a model of tactical brinksmanship and an histrionic style. And he felt at the end of his life a bit like Garibaldi in Italy, that he had become a stranger in his native land. And so the death of Carson in 1935 was a death that marked the end of someone who had created a divided Ireland, and a divided Ireland that ironically had broken his heart.